Tell us who you are, what you do, where you work, and what your focus is.
Well, I'm actually 172. I've been doing this for a long time. Evidently, exercise is the fountain of youth. No, in all seriousness, I'm James Steele. I'm currently an associate professor in sport and exercise science here at Solent University. I've been doing this for about more than 15 years now. I did an undergrad in sports science back in 2007, did my PhD from 2010 to 2014, and ever since then have been heavily involved in strength training research, resistance training, and broader stuff as well. So my PhD was around chronic low back pain and more sort of looking at clinical populations. And I've also been involved in kind of public health efforts around resistance training. I was actually involved in reviewing the evidence and producing the latest UK guidelines for physical activity, particularly focusing on the kind of resistance training component of that as well. And then, more recently, I've just become more sort of like, I think people are starting to see me as more of a methodologist nowadays, the guy who kind of rants about methods problems and stats problems and things like that.
Yeah, I can personally say, as someone who's also in the same field, that I see you as some degree of a sports scientist with an interest in meta-science, if you will. The science of science. And most sports scientists, in my experience, they like to get into the lab, collect data, and they are kind of maybe frustrated and intimidated by the process of trying to make sense of it. So I guess talk about the importance of understanding the science to the science.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I teach research methods predominantly here now, and the way I teach the module is very different from how I was taught it. I incorporate a lot of philosophy of science in there as well. I think people don't really get enough appreciation of, what actually is science, what are we actually trying to achieve with science? What are some of the inherent assumptions that go into the process of engaging with science? Some of the kinds of assumptions we make about what there is to know, the ontology as it's referred to, or, how do we go about actually producing knowledge of, what there is to know, the epistemology. And then in a broader sense, what are the, as you say, the kind of meta-science, the science of science, like science as a kind of social system aimed at kind of trying to presumably produce knowledge. It's something that as a social structure, social system itself, we can investigate scientifically and try to understand, how do actors actually work in that system themselves. But I think, some of the key things I try to get across to people are really trying to strip it back to basics and trying to answer those questions about, what is the phenomena you're interested in? How are we defining that? What is the concept? What is the construct? And what are the kind of operations you're doing to measure that? What is the question you're asking about it? And how do we think carefully, logically through the steps involved to get to the point where we can design a study that actually provides some meaningful answer to that question?
Got it. And in your mind right now, what are some of the main barriers to science being done in as effective and useful way as possible?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think one of the problems we face is it's very multifactorial, and it's kind of, there are systemic problems at various levels. So as I said, one of the main issues I see is around training and education. People don't come through, typical kind of sports science related degrees, getting any exposure to some of this more kind of deeper fundamental stuff. So they never come through and, go into potentially a research career pathway, having any understanding of that, nor do their supervisors, have they had any exposure to it? They're very fortunate if they get exposure to someone who's, kind of a bit weird and out there and is, thinking a bit more deeply about some of these things. So there's that kind of like throughput of people just going through, the motions of like, this is just science, as it runs on a day-to-day basis, what Kuhn, I guess, called kind of normal science. It's people kind of just tinkering and solving, tackling little puzzles and things like that. So I see that as kind of one of the main barriers, but that can be broken down into all sorts of kind of like fundamental issues. So the lack of kind of appreciation of sophisticated study design, how we think about the concepts that we're interested in, how we map our study designs and our statistical models onto those sorts of things. There are all of these kind of like barriers in terms of the level of education that people get. And so everything is kind of like, people joke that psychology has gone through this kind of, replication crisis, all sorts of other crises. But it can essentially be pinned down to, decades of psychological research being tried to, where people try to kind of basically stick a square peg through a round hole, which is to take all of these ideas and see if they can fit it into a 2x2 ANOVA design. And we largely do a similar sort of thing in our field. It's like, okay, we do a study, we do a pre-post, we do, it takes some measures, but we don't think carefully about like what are the measures of, what are we really trying to answer, how does the statistical model map onto the data generating processes we're trying to understand, and what can we kind of more meaningfully draw as theoretical conclusions from that. I struggle to see us currently as we stand as a theoretical science. I think we're a very young scientific field that is primarily focused on kind of applied questions, which is fine, but I think we can be so much more than that, and I think we can actually start to think more carefully about the ideas we have, the assumptions inherent in them, what kind of things are deductively entailed by the notions and kind of frameworks and ideas that we have. Pat talked about some of these ideas that exist out in the field based on years and years of experience from coaches and things. These are all things we could use to build better theories to then actually test in that sort of like Popperian and Lakatosian sort of way of saying, the way we kind of demarcate science from non-science is that we have theories that, if true, deductively entail that we should see certain things happen out there in the world. And the idea is we then go out and set up a test to, put that theory through the ringer and see if the observations that it predicts we should see, if it were true, actually pan out or not. And I think we kind of, that's kind of the steps I think we should be taking towards. We should be trying to think a bit more carefully and formally about what it is we're doing, rather than, just this kind of nickel and dime type science of, we'll get some people in, we'll do some tests, we'll get another paper on the CV, and that'll be that.
Yeah, I'm not sure there are many sports scientists who are taught that they need to develop a theory. They're taught to develop a research question and a hypothesis for it, and that's pretty much it. Why is that a problem?
In some senses, it's not. But I think one of the biggest issues I see is that, because I guess what you can do is you can think about the two different kinds of hypotheses that we have. Now, typically, as you say, people will come up with some sort of research question, and they might have some sort of hypotheses. And really what they end up having is what would be considered to be a statistical hypothesis. It's a hypothesis about, the A's will be bigger than the B's, or, we would expect to see, a correlation that's different from zero between these variables. They're very kind of like low-hanging fruit, boring statistical hypotheses, which are more kind of just baked into the way in which traditional kind of frequentist statistics is done. I mean, even Bayesian statistics, you have some kind of hypothesis that you start off with, some assumptions that are baked into the process that the operations that you're performing with the data. But on the other end, traditionally, from a kind of philosophy of science perspective, we have hypotheses as being the things that are deductively entailed by our theories. We have some theory that says we think muscle growth is controlled by some particular mechanism, and our theory says that mechanism is, responds in a dose-like fashion to some kind of stimulus, and that stimulus is linked to some sort of manipulation of external variable, and we can start to piece together all these things, and then we can sort of deductively entail, we think if we employ this, we should be able to see some sort of functional form of dose-response relationship and things like that. And that's the hypothesis that we then go out and test in a study, and we try as best as possible to map our statistical model onto that and our statistical hypothesis onto that theoretical hypothesis. But we just don't, like you say, get taught any of that. We don't even think that's a thing. Psychology as a field as well has gone through this big issue of being sort of a child of a philosophy known as operationalism, which is essentially states that the concept that is basically defined by what you do to get the data. It's defined by the set of operations you do. I'll give an example of this. People think in our field, and people talk about, they'll do a study. And maybe I'll be a bit mean to you as well, Pat, here. But we do a study and we say let's say we do a systematic review, meta-analysis or something like that, and we draw some broad conclusions about such and such impact of whatever variable on strength. And then so many times I pick up these studies and I go, oh well, they've limited their inclusion criteria to studies that have measured 1 rep max. So actually, what they mean is this is the impact on 1 rep max, not. We've got this concept strength, which is defined in a particular way. And 1 rep max is, in a given exercise, is an empirical indicator, an operation we use to give us information about that characteristic that we're interested in, that concept. And so, we have this kind of form of strong operationalism, I think, in our field, where the specific things we do, define the thing we're interested in. You take hypertrophy as well. There's so many different ways of measuring it. And we were sort of talking about this earlier, and particularly in physique sports. The main thing we're actually interested in is, do they look bigger? We don't care if their ultrasound thickness is 2 mil bigger, because if you can't notice it from a physique sports perspective, that's not the concept of interest. We should be trying to think about the actual ideas, the phenomena that we're interested in, and then how our measurements again map onto these sorts of things as well, to be able to design studies that actually really do get at the ideas that we're interested in.
So it sounds like we're not necessarily always measuring what we think we're measuring.
I think that's a good way of putting it. Or I think we're not even sure about what there is to measure in some cases. Like I say, there are... I can give one example. I'm heavily involved in or interested in the topic of effort, and that's come from my background in kind of resistance training. But it's led me down this interesting rabbit hole of what the hell even is effort? How do we define that concept? If I want to study and understand this, how do I go about kind of defining what it is I'm trying to understand? And similar sort of thinking can be applied, I think, to a whole range of different things. In fact, there have, I should say, been some interesting discussion about, how do we define strength and what is a good and a bad sort of empirical indicator of these sorts of things. But I think there's still room to sort of think more deeply about it. And there's room to kind of, I think, like I said as well, break out of the current kind of tiny toolbox of methods that we have in our field. There are so many other fields that have developed both in terms of broader kind of meta-scientific practices. You've got the whole open science movement coming from, particularly psychology as well, which we're slowly starting to adopt. Open data, pre-registration, things like this. But there are also just other sophisticated kind of methodological approaches and operations that have been employed in a whole host of different fields that are really useful and applicable for the things we're interested in as well. So, for example, in psychology, there's, measurement theories like explicit consideration of things like classical test theory and how it relates to opposing theories like item response theory. We're doing some stuff on thinking about how can we use these kinds of measurement theories that are aimed at measuring kind of unobservable phenomena through empirical indicators of them. So we're thinking at the moment of how do we apply things like latent variable modeling to this idea of strength as being a latent variable. You have some latent unobservable characteristic strength that is expressed in, I do a squat 1RM, or I do a bench 1RM, or I do a deadlift 1RM, or I do an isometric test on a dynamometer, and we kind of have this kind of theory that there is some unobservable, directly trait that is determining what all these things are. Now there'll be some deeper kind of physiological explanation, and the more we kind of flesh out the theory, the more we can piece those things together. But there are existing kind of statistical tools and models that we could use to try and sort of piece this together. Another good example as well is response variation stuff. We've recently done some interesting work around using meta-analyses of variation. We get so focused on mean values, we forget about all the other interesting statistical parameters that could be used to answer interesting questions. We've gone through such a, I call it it's the plague of GraphPad, because everyone suddenly realized that if you use GraphPad Prism, you can easily press one button and add all your raw data to the plot that you're making, and then everyone can go, look at that guy up there, that one dot up there. Look at all the response variation. But there are actually in other fields, in pharmacology, for example, people like Steven have done a lot of work on developing statistical approaches that can allow us to actually tease out true individual response variation from random noise, just within participant random error, from the actual interaction of an individual's response with, a certain kind of training. We've applied these meta-analytic approaches to look at how do you meta-analyze standard deviation so that you can see whether there is actually statistically differences in the variation, not just in the mean responses. And that's come from work in ecology and evolutionary science. We've taken some of these statistical techniques and models and we've just been applying them to strength training stuff and things that we do over in our little corner of the world. So I think there's so much kind of interesting questions that could be answered in such a more sophisticated manner if we just sort of broaden the approaches that we've got available to us.
Yeah, it sounds like two things. One is that some of the default settings of the way science is done, or I should at least say cataloged and communicated, are barriers to science growing in and of itself. And I think we should definitely talk about open science more. But also that there's a huge level of importance in interdisciplinary collaboration, where we can get exposed to other tools that we typically don't because we've been doing it a certain way because we have. Is that a relatively good summary of what you're saying?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's funny, again, to use the effort concept, I've been interested in the role of effort in resistance training for a long time, and branching out into it. It's amazing the amount of sort of cross-disciplinary kind of like pollination and sort of fertilization that can happen with ideas. I ended up getting quite heavily involved in kind of the measurement theory literature, trying to understand how I can apply it to this. And I've now been working on, well, how do we take the way we understand effort from physical tasks like resistance training and apply it to things like cognitive tasks and vice versa. So I've been working with psychometricians and things like that around this area, and they hadn't thought to themselves that they could learn from us, and hadn't realized that we can learn from them either. So I think this kind of like interdisciplinary collaboration, or actually, to be fair, like a colleague of mine, Chris Matthews, says that actually, in fact, it's kind of post-disciplinary. It's like who cares? Like forget about the disciplinary barriers. Just be a scientist. Like be curious, be interested, and think about the myriad of ways that you could go about kind of trying to investigate the phenomena that you're interested in. Don't think like, oh, they do that over there because they're such and such discipline. You use this, and another friend of mine calls it topic tourism. Go take holidays in little different places, figure out what you can learn, come back, use it and apply it to the field that you're really excited and interested about. But yeah, we can definitely learn so much more, I think, from more of this kind of like interdisciplinary work. And
when we do so, it's important to be able to communicate it in an effective way that impacts the rest of the field. So talk to me. You casually kind of threw out open science and gave us some characteristics about what that is. But for people who are not aware of what open science is, and let's say for the casual watcher of this interview, they are probably reasonably science interested, just because they wouldn't be watching my stuff if they weren't. So maybe they go like, oh, that's stuff in PubMed. That gives us an empirical perspective on things, but they probably don't really understand what we actually deal with as researchers try to publish our work. So what is open science? Why is it important? And why hasn't it always been that way?
Yeah, well, I mean, interestingly, historically, it probably was a long time ago much more open than it is now. I guess kind of for those who aren't aware, the general normal science, the kind of approach now is, you do a study, maybe you get some funding for a study, but we don't get a lot of funding for the research we do, so we'll forget that bit. But you do a study, you collect your data, you analyze your data, you write up your paper, you send that off to a journal, and then it takes ages to get reviewed, and it might get rejected, it might not, and then you go through some revisions, and maybe one day eventually like an editor goes, okay, right, we'll publish this, that's fine, and it'll be maybe 2 or 3 random people who hopefully have some expertise in the topic that your papers are on. But they'll be kind of like the gatekeepers of whether it gets out there or not. And all this time, you've potentially got quite valuable information that could be used, by practitioners, other scientists who are interested in, pursuing particular lines of investigation. So one of the original kind of aspects of the open science movement was more around kind of accessibility, because typically if a paper does get published in those journals, most of these journals are run by huge, for-profit publishers that make insane profit margins. I mean, it's a great business model, if you're a shareholder, but some of their profit margins are bigger than Apple, Microsoft. They're insane. And typically, you'll have limited access to be able to get hold of this information. You might see an abstract, like you say, on PubMed, but you might find it difficult to get hold of the actual full text and see what they did and try and, gain open access to the information that's available. So over time there's been this kind of movement towards trying to either increase accessibility to papers in journals. So journals offer open access options, but they normally come with quite a hefty fee. So there's been a movement towards more sort of what are called kind of green open access approaches. So, now, for example, many people might have heard of things like preprints. Particularly with the pandemic, preprints became more of a kind of household thing. And basically, with a preprint, what happens is, we finish a study, or finish up a draft of the manuscript that we're interested in, and we will make it available by uploading it to a public repository where people can access it immediately. It's there, available straight away. So we can start to get early feedback, maybe before we want to submit it to a journal. People can start to see the information and decide for themselves. They can be the peer reviewers of the paper. And then, there's, preprints aren't even a new thing, really. There have been some fields that have been doing it for decades. In fields like physics and economics, computer science and maths, pretty much everything is preprinted. And that's just the way they do it. In fact, in economics, they call the final publication of the paper the tombstone. Because one of the nice things with a preprint as well is you can keep updating it. If I preprint something, Eric, and you read my preprint and go oh, hey, I noticed you did this, have you thought about this? I can go, oh, that's a great idea, and I can go update it and upload a new version of it. Whereas when it's in the journal, no, that's its tombstone. That's it's the obituary's written down there. You can't change anything. That's where the paper goes to die. That's where it goes to rest forever. But this idea of kind of living science, this idea that we can keep adding to and iterating and think about this kind of more cumulatively, which I guess is more in line with kind of values that we sort of claim to hold as scientists, is more, can be achieved better with things like preprints and, more sort of open means of publishing. You've also got other things alongside there as well. So it may or may not be that interesting to, the interested layman or practitioner. But certainly for me as a researcher, things like open data are a huge thing. So we make all of our data openly available. When we publish a study, unless there's some legal issue where we're not able to, all of that data is openly available. You can get that data, you can go check our stats, I'll make all the analysis code is available, all the materials, everything there is transparently available so that you can go check them. And for me as a scientist, this is incredibly valuable as well, because sometimes I read a study and I go, oh, I would have loved it if they'd run this analysis, or if they'd checked that. I wonder if maybe I could go in and do that. And if the data's there, great, but most of the time it's not. From meta-analysis perspective as well, we do a lot of meta-analyses, and sometimes, the reporting in studies is terrible. But if the data was there, I could just download the data and I could analyze all the things I need to. In fact, we could do something even better. Meta-analyses are typically based on the summary data, but if we had access to all the individual data, we can do what's called an individual participant level meta-analysis, which is basically like one uber mega study of all the individuals themselves rather than the summary characteristics. So open data, is a really big thing that I think is incredibly important as well, and does facilitate kind of this more cumulative science. But I think one of the barriers to that is particularly, researchers who have come through that traditional training program, they're wary, they get, there's an incentive structure that is about publishing papers, not doing good science. And people are worried about sharing their data and someone someone else seeing it and going, like, oh, we could do that, because they think it might be a paper that they could miss publishing. That's a line on their CV that won't be there if they make their data available. So there's lots of kind of old conservative thinking and tradition that kind of gets in the way of a lot of this. But there's a slow movement towards it, and I think basically belligerent people like me shouting on social media and things about it, and just doing it myself, hopefully is sort of stimulating a bit of change.
Well, I would even say that probably more important than yelling on Twitter is that you actually have students who you teach to do this stuff. So talk to me about James Steele as a mentor who tries to get across to his PhD students, who will then eventually have their own PhD students, how to implement open science. What does that look like?
What does that look like? Well, I think Pac will agree. It's like it's this painful process of lifting the curtain and seeing what's behind it. But I try and embed this sort of thinking and exactly what we're discussing now right up front. Most of my students, fortunately, have had some exposure to me already through their undergrads, and they've already heard me talk about these ideas, because, like I said, I try to incorporate this into the way I teach and what I deliver to my students from undergrad level throughout. But for PhD students in particular, we have these conversations explicitly at the beginning, and I try and direct them to materials to help them sort of like understand these ideas a bit better. There are some great materials out there. You've got things like Dan Larkin's online courses, and there's just a huge kind of like rich literature now on kind of meta science and open science. I teach them about using platforms like the Open Science Framework to share their information. They learn about the value of preprints and these sorts of things, and eventually they get as frustrated as me with the current system of science. So if they get to that point, then I feel like I've communicated the ideas convincingly.
I would totally agree, and what I've seen is that is absolutely, those torches are being carried forward. So in spirit of that, is there anything beyond the questions I've asked is there anything you want to say on the importance of this, or communicate to the viewer about open science, or the importance of doing science better or differently that we didn't cover already?
The traditional kind of system and the way in which kind of like science operates as norm at the moment is, it's slowly shifting, but it will take some time for people to sort of like shed off the sorts of heuristics they've been used to. So, you get used to this kind of idea, particularly now, I think, in this sort of like field, and, what I sort of like see on social media, it's become a bit it's edgy and popular to be the kind of like hashtag evidence-based person who throws a PubMed ID up there and things like that. And there's still this sort of like, I see things like, people asking, is it peer reviewed, and these sorts of things. And so potentially things like preprints and, more of these kind of like open science practices are still not appreciated yet as being, in fact, oftentimes, particularly in a field like ours where it's still quite new, they're actually pretty good signals of good science normally. Like if someone is willing to share their work early and share all of their data and materials, then they're basically saying, look, I've got nothing to hide here. And actually, if you can find some errors in it, that would be great, because that would help me as a scientist. So, for particularly sort of like laymen and practitioners who are, are used to that sort of, relying on those arguments from authority and things like that, I think they've maybe got a little bit of a role to sort of like play in the scientific process themselves as well. You can still catch, issues and errors. Pac talked about the role of, incorporating expert opinion and stuff into the way we sort of develop our ideas and test those ideas as well. And I think that ties in with this idea of trying to think a bit more formally and theoretically about the work we're doing. But it doesn't have to be limited to being participants in the research. It can be as consumers of as critical consumers of the research as well. And so I think, shedding some of those kind of like, is it in a peer-reviewed journal heuristics, and was it published, in the last 5 years or whatever. Those sorts of things are going to give way to asking questions of like, is it openly available? Is there data available? Have they got anything to hide? Why aren't they sharing their analysis code and things like that? Even if you don't understand what's in there, the fact that it's shared is a signal that like, we're not trying to hide anything here. And I think it, lends more kind of credence and creates a more trustworthy sort of science.
Awesome.